This webinar, COVID-19 and the use of electronic data. Now, we see the use of e-data as one of the most debated policy responses to the pandemic in the EU. Here, cooperation with telecommunications and IT companies is at the very high of the policy agenda. Particularly, we've seen ideas such as the development of mobile applications on contact tracing or even mapping movements of people. And today's webinar goal, the goal of the discussion, is to discuss the impacts of these ideas of surveillance measures on trust, privacy, and the rule of law. More generally, how can these technologies affect our societies? And we live in democratic societies in Europe where rule of law and fundamental rights are core components of constitutional traditions. And of course, bringing the private sector with such a big responsibility at the core of that responsibility raises many questions, open questions like sovereignty. What about the sovereignty of states? What about data transfers to third countries that do not have equivalent level of data protection like in the EU? But also for people. You know, I think we all understand that there is a high level of intrusiveness in these measures for citizens and residents, and also entail a number of risks for discrimination and stigmatization. So very interesting questions that we will address today. Now, very briefly, the rules of procedure. We have 1 hour, and I will need to keep the time very tight. After the keynote speech by Vera Jourova, Vice President of the European Commission, that I would like to welcome and also thank her for her availability to participate in today's debate. We will have 3 discussants. The first one, Lais Fu, Director General of ETNO, European Telecommunications Network Operators Association. The next will be my colleague, Andrea Renda, Senior Research Fellow at CEPS, and he's in charge of the grid unit. And the last discussant, Balsami Smith-Selegas, Professor at the School of Law at Queen Mary University, London. Really thanks to the 3 of you also for joining. Now, concerning Q&A, just to tell you that please write up 1 question for those who are watching, 1 question in the Q&A option in Zoom. We will be filtering and selecting those questions and posting them back to the panel. Please also introduce yourself in that question and say to whom that question is addressed to. So, Commissioner Jourova, we look forward to hearing your speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergio. Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank you, first of all, for the invitation to this online webinar. And I want to thank all the participants for joining us. Yes, you have enumerated so many important topics, and we have only 1 hour, so I will try to be brief and to keep the space for the only 1 question. But we need to discuss everything in also how to say in connection, because rule of law and privacy protection, freedom of speech, these are all the matters which are now under what I say sometimes stress test. Because coronavirus is unprecedented situation. It affected every person in every country. It affected the whole EU, but the impact will be asymmetric. And what we have to pay attention to is that we will come back to normal, and we will restore again among other things, the constitutional powers and democracy in its best shape. We also experience some good things. The first time in history, we can feel that the full power of technology and its impact on our work and lives is fully deployed. It's probably the first time when we see how useful it is to keep us going on. Yeah, this is the first time we see the existential need of the digital tools. Many employees have been able to work from home remotely. I myself miss the people, but and it's of course not only my case, but thanks to the online meetings and videos, we can continue working. You know, I was responsible for the gender equality matters in the last mandate, and we came with the work-life balance package. And it was clearly stipulated there that this is time to deploy the online possibilities for working parents to combine work and family duties. So these are the novelties we could harvest and we could develop further. So these are all very good developments. The current pandemic also knows no borders. Data and technology can help us in the fight against coronavirus and in gradual lifting of restrictions and the restoration of free movement of people. This is very important, and here the role of technology is crucial. But let me be clear from the start, in dealing with emergencies and using technology, we must preserve our freedoms. People's privacy should not be undermined by technology and will be used to tackle the crisis. Technology or data alone will not be enough to fight the crisis. They can support different measures, but cannot be seen in isolation. So their success will depend on the healthcare system, on testing strategy and testing capacities, and general approach of the countries to fight the virus, among others. In this respect, the Commission acted very fast to ensure that Member States approach these technological solutions based on European law, respect of fundamental rights, and on some degree of interoperability. I always say that the emergency situation and emergency regimes must not switch off constitutions, but also must not switch off EU rules, including GDPR. So I think that this is the core principle. When it comes to the tracing applications, the Commission adopted a recommendation on the 8th of April, setting out principles ensuring the respect of fundamental rights, in particular the right to privacy and personal data protection, and what's important, the prevention of mass surveillance and stigmatization. It was followed by a common EU toolbox developed by the Member States with the support of the Commission and complemented by Commission guidance on the respect of privacy and data protection. And also recently the interoperability guidelines were agreed by Member States in the e-health network with the support of the Commission again. When you look into our guidelines, you will see several key principles. First, national health authorities or authorities responsible for the crisis management should be the controller. Second, the installation of an app on a user's device must be voluntary. If proximity data is used, it should be stored on an individual's device and only shared at the initiative of the user. This is, again, you hear GDPR behind that. Individual people's rights first, even in these new tools. For contact tracing, there is no use of geolocation data, only proximity data based on Bluetooth. Only the personal data that are necessary to meet the purpose of the app can be processed. Another principle, the identity of the user of the app will not be disclosed to other users. The personal data should not be kept for longer than necessary. Timelines should be based on medical relevance. In addition, the applications, the apps should be only used during the crisis and be deactivated at the latest when the pandemic is over. The deactivation, and this is important, should not depend on deinstallation by the user. Yeah. For emergency time, we have several key principles that the measures used must be only necessary, strictly proportionate, and time limited. And this applies to the use of these tools, of course, as well. The data and the entire application should be protected through state-of-the-art security techniques, including encryption. And final principle, which we stress in our guidelines, is that data protection authorities should be fully involved and consulted in the development of an app and should keep its deployment under review. And this is what we saw. All the data protection authorities in all the member states are on the cases, they are consulted, they give opinions, and also the European Data Protection Board is very actively engaged in it. Remember, by GDPR, we wanted to have the principle, one continent, one law. This still applies. That's why the European Board role is so important. This crisis is pan-European. It only makes sense to create an approach that works in all the countries. For this, the systems need to talk to each other and have some set of common features. But we must do it all in European way. People must trust that this solution is to help them and not to spy them. Whenever we speak about data privacy, we speak about trust. Again, the same story. So it's extraordinary situation, but we are using old good principles. I insist on the point that there must be no doubt these applications cannot be used for mass surveillance or be some backdoor for our law enforcement authorities. People will and should keep control of their data. This is the foundation for the accuracy and effectiveness of these applications to contain the spread of the virus. It is therefore essential to identify the least intrusive solutions which fully comply with the requirements for the protection of personal data and confidentiality. Speaking about less intrusive, I want to be clear. We give the full support for tracing, but not for tracking. Yeah, so this is very clear, because tracking for us seems to be too intrusive and not necessary in this situation. Again, with the reference to GDPR, I have to remind us of the concept of privacy by design, and this all remains valid and in force. I think that I speak too long, so I will be available for the question. Last comment, if you want to ask about the GDPR review, we are now working intensively on it. And I am mentioning it in with reference to what you said, Sergio, that we will be also testing our international transfer. So this is part of this exercise. So in June, we will have the review done, and the consultation process is delivering a lot of very valuable contributions and ideas. I have skipped many things I wanted to say, but I want to keep the space for others. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner, for also reminding us about the positive implications that technology has brought to all of us during this difficult time, to remain connected, even if not physically, but socially connected, and the importance, also the implications on our employment and the benefits that it brings. And thank you also for highlighting the importance as well of not switching off, even during pandemics, the constitutional principle of EU law that defines what the European Union is in these areas. So the guidelines that you've mentioned point out a number of very relevant aspects that I'm sure we will come back during the discussion. I will start with Lais. Lais, you have the floor.
I see. I am unmuted now. Can you hear me? Good. Thank you. Well, I represent ETNO, who is the Association of Leading Telecom Companies. We were founded in 1992 when the Maastricht Treaty actually laid the foundation for the single market. And apart from the GDPR 2-year anniversary, there is another anniversary for us. We will turn 28 this week. So first of all, thank you to SEPS for the invite, and also thank you very much to Vice President Jourova as citizens, but also as companies, it's important to know that you and the Commission are there to watch out on crucial issues such as fundamental rights and disinformation, especially in a moment like this where we have a crisis. And I would like to share with you three insights in three areas. First, how the tech and the telecoms industry is looking into this pandemic. Second, what is our experience with data? Third, some considerations around apps. And if we look at digital telcos and the pandemic, just like all businesses and citizens, this has been a major challenge for all of us, of course. Our first priority as telcos was to keep networks up and running. Our engineers worked to cope with the data spikes of plus 50% of average use. At the same time, a lot of our members activated free or unlimited offers for those staying at home. Just think of Proximus in Belgium. We have T-Mobile in Germany, TIM in Italy, and basically all of our members actually did an increase in use for their customers. And we also saw many European telcos starting partnering with schools and SMEs to allow them to go swiftly online, because as also Vice President Jourova was saying, we had to go digital in the time of a crisis. And that actually brings me down to two key learnings that we have, and that regards the first part of this intervention. First and foremost, more than ever, it's clear that, of course, investing in 5G and fiber networks is more crucial than ever in order to for Europe in a recovery scenario. We still need digital. It's not the only solution, but it's actually extremely important as a part of the solution. Second, we need to put forward all necessary policies to digitize all European companies and administrations. What we see now is actually the most digital economies are the ones that are coping best with the corona crisis. So that's a key learning that we can take away from this. If I go over to our experience on data, I'll keep this short. A crucial part of digitalizing Europe is taking a value-based and trustworthy approach to data. I agree with Vice President Jourova here. We need to have a solid European approach to data. And coronavirus taught us a lot on this as telcos. The first one, and here I will be very honest, as telco operators, we're very conservative when it comes to data. We fully understand and understood during the crisis the power of data. So when health authorities and epidemiologists and also the European Commission came to us and asked for our help, we were cautious not to give data, but the way we were giving the data in. So we have actually developed further partnerships also with local and national authorities, because we think it's important to help. We have a strong and historic privacy culture as telcos, and as a sector, we have been used to actually implement GDPR standards before they were actually in place. So we have complied with privacy standards for a long time. So, but what we brought to the table in the crisis were anonymized and aggregated data from our networks. And this means that they are not targeting any individuals, but they're being used to detect behaviors of groups. And that is a great help to epidemiologists, also to understand in lockdown measures what are effective and what are not effective. But it's also important for us to actually understand what territories or areas are most at risk. And it's also important that made us understand the full and good power of what data, telecom data can have for society as such. And the scope and the use of telecom data is extremely important because it's very different from the one of the apps. And that brings me on to the apps, where my last point is, how do we see tracking apps? First and foremost, and this is an echo again of Vice President Jourova here, it's an important complement to keep Europeans safe, but it's a complement. And if we are to reopen borders gradually, tracing apps can be of huge help for Europe as such. And I think that's also why it was important that the Commission recommends that they are interoperable, the apps. A second very important aspect for us is that when I say it's a complement again, I mean that we think too often that technology can solve all problems, but the apps cannot solve the issues with potential risk of COVID if we don't follow it up with testing or scarce resources for tracing positive individuals. You need to do a follow-up to whatever technology brings to the table in relation to COVID. But it will be a tool to alert, inform, and produce anonymized lists. But then we have the health authorities that must follow up and act upon this. And the third and final point is privacy remains fundamental. It's again the key. I know there is a strong debate if anonymized data is really anonymized. And as I also agree, we cannot only simplify by saying that once we download social media apps, we should not be concerned about any anti-coronavirus app. That's not just how the world works. But I think if we need to look into the GDPR, we need to look into the e-privacy directive, and we need to have a close dialogue on how data authorities can help us overcome any lack of trust that might arise around this. So let me very quickly conclude with a short story from the real life. One of the first week of the crisis, I was on the phone with one of our member companies, and one of my colleagues from the company told me that he was trying to shake up things internally to ensure that his team and the regulators together would sort out a privacy compliant way to use the data for good. Because as he said to me, in full conscience, I cannot sit on data like this that I have that I know can save lives and do nothing with it because I'm scared of privacy regulation. So here, it's actually not to simplify things, but we have an important case of reconciling interests, keeping citizens healthier and safeguarding privacy. These are two very important factors. And that's why I welcome this debate today, because I think these two interests can and they should be reconciled. Thank you.
Thank you, Laise, for mentioning these reconciling interests and also highlighting the value-based and trustworthy approach in the way forward, and also putting, bringing light into examples of how companies have played a role, in facilitating things. Really big thanks for your contribution. Andrea.
Thank you, Sergio, and thanks for having me as part of this very interesting conversation. And thanks also to Vice President Jourova and to Lise for the interesting speeches and contributions. I will try to offer a few comments from my perspective as being a social scientist.
Sorry, Andrea, there is a problem with the sounds for some reason. We cannot hear you.
Now maybe.
Now we can hear you. Yes, please
I
go
don't
ahead.
know. I didn't do anything, but
Please go ahead.
anyway. So, and that brings me to what I was about to say anyway. So, the early days of the internet, some of the most enlightened speakers, for example, Larry Lessig, pointed out that the internet is a strange animal for law, because in the internet, rather than law, it is code. It is the architecture that determines what's possible. And legislation will always have problems in trying to tame that beast, and actually did very little to do that in the very beginning, especially if you go to the US, but also to some extent in Europe. Well, the stance that we adopted towards the emergence of the digital economy has been largely light-handed, right? Or it's rather self or in some cases even non-regulatory with respect to other sectors of the digital ecosystem. And that is very important because over time we have realized that technology promises much, but it's not that we should always do what technology can do. Meaning of the many things that technology can do, we then have to choose the ones that we want technology to do. And that is, I think, the typical case with the subject matter that we have today. Governments may be caught by surprise because of the COVID-19 outbreak that was foreseeable but not foreseen, have run short of easy solutions or explanations in terms of testing, in terms of masks, in terms of other, perhaps more pragmatic and maybe more effective solutions. And many of them have been tempted by this idea that contact tracing apps could actually have this thaumaturgical power, right? That they could actually help us to some extent fix the problem or really create a situation in which our reality in coexisting with others could be facilitated by technology. Well, I have many doubts about this for many reasons, being myself a technology expert. And correctly, Vice President Jourova was reminding that whatever deviation or derogation from the GDPR has to follow specific principles, necessity, proportionality, the time-limited nature of the data that are connected. But I would actually question the necessity even more than the proportionality and the time-limited nature here. Imagine you are in the typical situation of the contact tracing app. You are in a situation in which if you're in lockdown and you enforce it seriously, that's not going to be helpful, of course. So the contact tracing apps become potentially useful once you cross the doorstep, right? And imagine you cross the doorstep in the way in which we're doing this today, with people actually mingling quite a lot in public spaces. And what happens in a contact tracing app is that if you really want to take the privacy preserving part, which I would advocate, obviously, and the decentralized collection of information and data, which is what is being proposed by researchers, which is what has been recommended by institutions, basically what would happen is that if someone is tested, and by the way, you still need extensive testing and extensive and repeated testing for this. If someone is tested and proves positive with SARS-CoV-2, then the contacts will be, the person that have been within Bluetooth reach over the past couple of weeks will be reached by, in the most privacy preserving decentralized version, a message by the smartphone, which has not been mediated by anyone, where the phone would tell you to do something because you might have been, you have been within reach. You don't know whether 10 meters or 1 meter. You don't know whether for 15 minutes or an hour. You don't know when or where, but you know, over the past 2 weeks, you've been within reach of someone that later tested positive, okay? Because the phone said so. And that is something that, in my opinion, would never work. It would suffice for us to have a minimal excuse, for example, that we need to go to work and we would need to disclose this information and have the information being somehow valid for someone if we wanted to have this as a justification from not going out, right? If we want to self-isolate at home, that would be actually very complicated. If we want to go and get tested, we would need to go to the places where no one wants to go now, which are hospitals, right? And if by any chance we've been wearing a mask when we went to the supermarket, and that's the only thing we've done over the past couple of weeks, we would think, oh, by the way, I was wearing a mask. So this message from the phone maybe is not very useful because I was protecting myself, or it's likely that maybe I'm not on the wrong side. So not only the problem of the contact tracing apps is the fact that in principle, they only work if 60, 70% of the population download them. And this has never happened in any country, even if the famous Trace Together app in Singapore really fell short, massively short of that, with only, say, 15% of the population downloading it. So the real thaumaturgical effect is not there. But even in operation, we are, I think, face a dilemma, which is a typical dilemma of technology versus law. We know that the app only works if we take away the law. So that if you take the centralized solution, if you collect the data, if health authorities can use the data to trace potential contacts, these are chased not by phones, by people, and they're asked to self-isolate, and they are tested. This might prove very effective in containing the contagion in a post-lockdown phase. But this is not a price that we are supposed to pay in terms of the disproportionate nature and the privacy violating nature of most of these rules. This is not an easy question, because I just postulated as like a tenet. We are not available, we're not willing to pay that price. But are we? And this is the last thing that I want to say here. Certainly, I'm not willing to pay that price, okay? But you might remember that after the Charlie Hebdo and Bataclan terrorist attacks, when surveyed, French citizens declared themselves to be much less willing to have their privacy protected in the name of security. Right? When people are told the only way you can go out and you can cross that doorstep that something you've been longing for, the only way you can do that is to accept this little inch of surveillance. Well, I think people might change their attitudes, and this is where one has to be assertive and firm. And I think the EU institutions have been assertive and firm, but they might want to be even more wary of the risks there are there. One might think that these things never change, right? That Europe has its own values and always protects them. But I think in reality, things can change. And as a footnote to that, the time limited nature of the collection of data is also very questionable, because information can be copied, stored in countless ways. I mean, it's almost counterintuitive to ask for the timely availability of information, because information, when in digital form, by definition, has zero marginal cost and can be replicated at zero cost and kept in various locations with no possibility for actual control. So, the behavioral nature, the relevance of people's preferences, the evolution of the interplay between technology and law lead us into really the space of trustworthiness. And I think this is where everybody needs to contribute. The industry that Lisa represents, the institutions, the academics. We need to make sure that we don't offer through technology the easy solutions that technology cannot offer, and the easy and uncontroversial solution that technology cannot offer. Now, of the many things that I do where I'm really enthusiastic about technology, just to close, and maybe at the risk of oversimplifying, contact tracing apps are definitely not one that leaves me positive and enthusiastic, because I don't think they will be much more than a tiny complement in a way more complicated mix of measures.
Thank you, Andrea, for bringing in so many details in your presentation. Balsamis, you're next.
Thank you very much, Sergio, for inviting me. Thank you to Vice President Jourova and for the discussions, for these insightful comments. And I will try to keep it short and keep it to 5 minutes and answer to each of the subtitles of the title of your seminar today. So, privacy, trust, and the rule of law. I will start with privacy, and I will not say much apart from the fact that this is an exceptional situation. I think we should be vigilant not to normalize an attitude based on states of emergency. And I think that when we look at the privacy standards that should guide our behavior currently, it's not only the GDPR, and I understand why the focus is on the GDPR, but it is also the Charter. And the Charter is important because it brings the constitutional values of the Union to the fore. And we have a very interesting, I think, precedent here. And one of the speakers has mentioned is how we have responded to counterterrorism so far. And we have very important judgments in Luxembourg, such as Digital Rights Ireland, where the Court of Justice ruled against mass surveillance not on the basis of necessarily the right to data protection or the GDPR, but on the basis of the right to privacy. So I think in this context, I think we should really be able to constitutionalize the debate and to say that in this sphere where we may have generalized surveillance, whether you call it mass or not, it remains to be seen, we need really to frame it within our constitutional values. I think also it's important to look at the issue of necessity and proportionality, because what has not been clear, I think, in a number of contexts in justifications to interference with privacy is really what these initiatives are for. And it's one thing to say that these initiatives are for in order necessary and proportionate to address an imminent health crisis and existential life against an existential threat against the life of the population. And another level to say that this is about keeping people's health in a satisfactory level, or as it has been floated, advancing scientific knowledge, so in the future we can, we can advance better responses against this kind of viruses. I don't think the two have an equal weight when we assess necessity or proportionality, and I think we need to be very careful, because the more you justify the use of this data for scientific advances, the more you are led to mass surveillance, in a sense. So, I think we need to be very, very careful to justify why we need this data for. And I think, well, Andrea said it's very important, what is technology here for? What are we really trying to achieve? We shouldn't really lose sight of this, because debates are being really convoluted, I think, on that. The question of trust, to go to the second point, I think in my view is hugely important. It is hugely important because these are systems that rely, whether they're centralized or decentralized, on their use by citizens. And this was mentioned, I think, by all speakers today. And I am very concerned that this does not lead actually to discrimination or stigmatization, because I think the Commission rightly pointed out that voluntary use is really preferable. I'm not even sure that you can enforce mandatory use anyway. But I think we need to remember that voluntary means, also according to the case of the Court of Justice, in the case of Schwartz, that citizens have a real choice, that you cannot really, something cannot be voluntary if refusing to take part really leads you to exclusion from society. And I think in this discussion, when, we're talking about surveillance enforced through apps and through smartphones, there is a real danger, I think, in my view, of what will happen to those who either refuse to download an app out of conscious choice, out of privacy concerns, for example, or those who do not have access to technology. What will happen, in a situation in life where we try to manage risk and to open up our shops and our travel, when, you have citizens who do not participate in these tracing systems that have been introduced? Will they be excluded? Will they have a claim to life, after COVID? I think there are huge risks, I think, here of discrimination, of stigmatization. Who is a good and a bad citizen? I mean, here in the UK, probably you're following the debate on and the framing of the issue as, that you have to be a good citizen, a responsible citizen to save lives by downloading an app. And I think that this raises many, many questions, I think, of trust from the state to the individual and vice versa. The third point, I think, has to do with the rule of law, but I want to link the rule of law here with issues of the privatization, I think, of responses to COVID-19 and to technology. And I think here, what is important, I think, to note, and I would also agree that we should link these framing to what we have had so far in terms of counterterrorism, because I think the private sector is now coming to respond to that, to help the state with that, as we have seen in terms of data retention, and most recently, and the Vice President is very familiar with this, about in case of digital evidence and of removing terrorist content online. So the private sector is really called upon more and more to take on, if you like, state responsibilities, for what is deemed to be existential threats. And there, I think we need to be very careful in order to delimit what the extent of the public-private partnership is, or what the limits and the responsibilities, I think, of the private sector is. Because my feeling is that sometimes the private sector is really being put in an impossible situation in all these developments. Perhaps this is inevitable in view of the dominance of the digital as well. I will finish, I think, with a comment on technology, which is more linked to interoperability. And I read with interest the latest Commission guidance on interoperability. Interoperability can be seen critically as an attempt, again, to say that technology will solve everything, and that because we frame it as a technical issue, what happens then is that you depoliticize the issue, so you do not really discuss in detail what is the impact of interoperability on citizens' lives, and also from a rule of law perspective. Because what is really not clear is that, of course, we need to have some sort of common standards if we are to ensure parity and free movement, at least across the EU, but also beyond. But on the other hand, how can you really maximize transfer and access to data when we know already that even at the national level, the gathering of this data and its exchanges is already problematic? So, I think that to say that we have these very fragile systems of tracing and tracking currently, and to say that the next step is really to link everything together so data can be transferred from A to B in order then to link it, to make the prerequisite of free movement, I think is highly problematic. And I think we need to be very, very critical about how we can safeguard true free movement in these times. I will stop here, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Elsa. Thank you to all. So participants are also raising a number of points that some of you have covered. I would like to come back to Commissioner Jourova with a couple of them. The first one participant mentions about the freedom of movement and forcing people to move from Schengen as long as they have this sort of app or tracing surveillance possibility. The person raises, what does this mean for the freedom to move? Because people will be moving, but under surveillance. And the second question, Commissioner Jourova, also relates to interoperability. It comes back to Sami's point as well, on how to ensure that the data will not be misused when taking this step of interlinking different systems. How precisely could GDPR, which has been compliant, has been postponed, be upheld in those in that scenario?
You muted.
I didn't hear the beginning, so I hope I understood the question on the freedom of movement. Well, how to manage the whole situation when the people will move and will be under permanent surveillance. I understood this question like that. Well, indeed, that's why not to have different standards for the people moving across Europe. That's why the Commission came with this common set of rules and principles, which have to be respected in all the tools developed by the member states, because there might be, it's not a theory, it's a current practice. There are and might be different apps developed by different member states, which respect the same principles and the same safeguards which I described before. So I think that interoperability is a practical arrangement because we want the people to start using Schengen area again and all the freedoms, but to do it in a safe way. And that's why we are urging all the member states to respect the rules which we came with. And I am so tempted to react on what you have spoken about, but we don't have time, and I will leave space for other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. There is one participant, perhaps for you, Andrea, on the issue of centralized system and the possibility of testing. the participant wonders if it will be feasible to have such a centralized system in compliance with GDPR. If you would like to comment on that.
Yes, very quickly. It is possible, of course. You can have a very secure cloud-based solution where the data is stored centrally, and there's no possibility to access and reuse the data for any other purpose. It's of course, but as always, based on trust. It's not, in my opinion, the technological solution, rather the sense of control of the data in the hands of the end users, if you wish, and the enhanced trust that is generated by the fact that the data do not leave the device. Technically, as I was saying before, technically everything is possible. And indeed, many cloud-based services are, the cloud-based services are GDPR compliant. And so in principle, they could offer a similar level of reliability to the end users. The issue is, do we trust centralized storage, where the data are going to be stored, and do we really trust that this data will not be reused and then will be eliminated or not copied, not stored elsewhere? That is the issue. But certainly the answer to the question is yes, it's possible to have a centralized storage of the data and compliance with GDPR, even beyond GDPR.
Thank you. Laise, would you like to comment on this possibility and also the position of ETNO on this point?
For us, we actually think we haven't worked very much on the centralized versus the decentralized app service. We have not, because it's something that works on our networks, and we're not very much into the app business. But that being said, from our point of view, and we know most are implementing decentralized apps all over Europe, we think that, of course, we can have services that are compliant with GDPR and e-privacy, but we see as telcos the solution on the network data for the moment being is creating risks and problems for the use of data to help in the COVID-19 crisis. And that has created a lot of concerns among our members. So what is important here is that we have clear guidelines and we have active DPAs that we have worked with already for many years on solutions. And from our side, when the crisis actually happened, we had many members that already could help, like the day after. We had some in the Nordics that could take out solutions on the networks. So if I am to look into not centralized versus decentralized, but if I'm to look into the network data versus the app, I see that the network data, we could actually start right away. We could use it. We had a set of rules that worked. Where the app is a different, we need a lot of reiterations, we need a lot of considerations on how to do it in a trustworthy and safe way. And for the moment, we actually had a lot of data as telcos that complied with GDPR and also e-privacy that we could use.
Thank you. Balsamis, one participant says expressly that crises are not good moment for policymaking. And she raises the question, and what can we learn from, we were mentioning before, terrorism? You know, the measures that have been implemented when terrorism events happen. Andrea was also mentioning this point. What can we learn, the participant raises, what are the lessons learned from what should not be done in this regard?
Well, I mentioned it a bit in my comments. I think not to legislate in haste and to really try to answer to a specific emergency, you know, in a very proportionate manner. I know this is very difficult, and then be very conscious of the fact that you shouldn't overreach. So, you know, what you should do should be proportionate in that regard, and it should also be time limited. Because I think the suspicion, especially in the digital world, is that because the technology is here to stay, and because we're all using this, it's part of our everyday life in a sense, you know, it is almost existential, you know, we all live in the digital world. I think the big concern is that any solution that is devised now becomes more or less permanent and leads on to the development of separate proposals or legislation in order, for example, to achieve, in the sake of convenience, easier access to health system or easier cross-border movement and so on. We know that in EU law, we already have quite a proliferation of surveillance in terms of third country nationals on the basis of technology. And I think the big challenge, I think here is whether this will become generalized with the COVID crisis being used really as a bridge to do that. So I think we should be calm about it. As Andrea said, we should really be very conscious about the effectiveness of what we propose, because, you know, some of the measures that are touted as being solutions may not perhaps be the most effective solutions from a public health perspective. And I understand that it is very difficult for politicians, but I think we need to be very brave when we see that something is not as effective and to say, you know, these are the limits. I think in this perspective, the debate is all about trust, and trust is very fragile, and we shouldn't be taking it for granted either way.
Excellent. If I may do a follow-up question on the legality, how do you see the legality when it comes to free movement of linking this idea of a passport or a document linked to health data that citizens should or would use for them to freely circulate in the EU? Do you see that in compliance with EU free movement law and citizenship law?
I cannot give you a general answer on this. I mean, in principle, of course, it raises a lot of worries. I think the devil is in the detail. I think it depends really on what will be required for what kind of cases and whether this will be time limited as well, you know, and how this is justified for, you know. I would be, if every European country is opening their borders, how long will you introduce it for? Until a vaccine is found, until every European citizen is vaccinated, until we have medication on that. You know, these are very big questions, I think. And I think I would only like to point out that we already have worrying trends on surveillance of free movement already in EU law, most notably by the internalization by the European Union of the American PNR system, where, you know, where we have passenger name records in the context of counterterrorism being transferred into flights coming into the EU, and for some member states, if they have agreed, also into intra-EU flights. I mean, you can question whether, you know, this is also compatible, in my view, with freedom of movement in a sense. So, you know, so I cannot give you a general answer about this meets the legality or not, because we will have to see what will be required. But I think I'm very concerned about arguments linking, if you like, health, and technology as a prerequisite, if you like, and surveillance as a prerequisite of free movement. I think for me, this goes against what we know of freedom within the area of freedom, security, and justice.
Thank you, Balsamis, and thank you all. So we are about to close the webinar. I think that it has come quite clearly from all your interventions. I think this consensus on the need to really look effectively what is needed, if anything, that we all of course want to do things that work, but it is very important you highlighted to ensure the effectiveness of the measures and the purpose of those measures. And also this technology and law, as we can reconcile technology not versus law, but technology with law, along with, together, technology and law. As I've learned from your interventions, this can be a key ingredient to secure trust, not only from citizens, but also from private sector and from states. So if anything, I think I'm taking this as a takeaway of today's conversation. Thanks to all of you for this exchange. We had an excellent debate, in short. It was super interesting. And on behalf of SEPS, really thank you, and we'll keep in touch. Thanks also to all the participants that are still watching for your questions and participation.
Have a good day. Thank you.
Have a good day.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.